there seems to be like this big conversation happening between you and Disney this whole time about who owns what during this 2-year period of time. And I was wondering if there were any lessons from those conversations that you learned that might be relevant for engineering leaders, like in coming up with the structure between the new entity and the assets being transferred. Were there any lessons from that conversation or particular moments that went really well, that would be a good thing to call out for any engineering leader who maybe is entering into those types of negotiations?
There was mutual respect between the teams, right? We were, as I think, approaching it from that perspective, like, hey, we're both like technologists. We both want to be able to deliver the best technology for our respective companies. Like, let's have an honest conversation about really what the current capabilities are. I think we were extremely honest, both sides, about, there was no, like, we weren't trying to like, I wasn't trying to like sell them a bunch of junk and say that it's something that it's not, right? Like, I think it's important to be honest in these conversations. This is what it's actually going, this is the size of the team that currently maintains this technology. It's probably going to be what's required in the future, right? So I think one thing that works is like to come from a position of mutual respect. We had these working sessions. We were very detailed, I think very honest about what the current state was. Um, but then to have like a few of your like bright lines. I mean, for us, it was extremely clarifying to say, by default, the technology is with you, right? And anytime they'd say, well, actually, it seems like we don't really know enough about that technology. Maybe you guys should keep it on. I'm like, by default, the technology is with you, right? And I could always like come back to that. And that came from the highest levels, right? So that was like, so I think that was one thing, is like, can you have these guiding principles? You're going to approach the conversation honestly. You're going to come from a position of mutual respect. But there's going to be moments where like, each of you kind of want a different outcome around a specific decision. And it's really useful to have these like agreed upon principles that by default we're going to adhere to. So and that's what we were able to get through the right advocacy, I think, with like the top 3 people at Fox who had our back on all those conversations. And occasionally we had to call them up and say, you need to tell them, like, this was the deal. Like, we're not going to take on this responsibility. By default, it's with them.
The learning can be teased out from a few different angles, for engineering leaders, of course, but also for those that are sort of driving decision like this as executive or as a CEO. Story wise, I think this is something people are going to remember, and I think the dividends from this conversation, the learning will be teased out over time. And when it came across a situation like this, oh, this is something that happened, and I can refer back to that for some insights.
I'm taking as many notes as possible because this is one of those moments where I feel like as an engineering leader, like you don't get that many shots on goal to do this the right way. And so the learning curve seems really steep and high pressure and high intensity. So I wanted to ask you one more question about the deal structuring and negotiation. For somebody who's never been in that room and who's never had a conversation like that, is there any recommendations you would give to help somebody prepare for their first M&A type conversation or strategically defining a TSA?
Yeah, I think for engineering leadership, I think really being able to paint a picture of the future and what that can enable is what gets, I think, the business excited to be willing to like go to bat for you, right? So, I mean, we had, in order to, I think, I think it's fair to say the executive team was not initially on board with this approach, or like initially was risky, right? And so you have to say like, well, what is the reward to taking this risk? Because it would have worked the other way, right? And it would have been safer. And so and I think that's often the challenge for engineering leadership. Like, they're often abstracted away from pain, right? Of technical pain. Initially, you kind of have to paint the picture of like, in 2 years, here's where we could be, if we took this approach. And that is quite compelling, I think. And so and part of that then, actually, I think probably the slide that won the battle here was, here's our 2-year projection of what percent of our technology budget, which is over $1 billion, what percentage of our technology budget is going to running the business versus growing the business? And it was something like 60-40. before the transaction, 60% running, 40% growing. So, and then we said, we think it's going to be inverted in 2 years. And it is. And so I think that's the slide that kind of like sealed the deal. We really partnered with finance. We had to partner with like all the business units to like make these projections real. I mean, it's a nice thing to say we're going to flip 60-40, right? But it had to be like actually grounded in real data. Like, what are teams spending time on? We have a team over 1,000 technologists. What are they spending their time on today? How many people are like literally running the data centers versus like coding our software platform, our like software for streaming? So that I think is painting the future, and then speaking then in a language that the business can care about, because they don't really care about, honestly, like, oh, like we have 5 engineers who have a really brutal job, like having to maintain this like old ERP system. They're like, like, I don't, I don't really care. So, you have to paint it in business terms. So I think that'd probably be the biggest thing. Is like, what is the future, and then how do you translate that to actual business results?
Yeah, and then a side insight I get from that is that think about those plans before you're in position to have to think about it, right? You mentioned that the team is running fine, right? You can sustain the load and can continue to grow the business, but that's probably the better time or best time to think about future plans versus your in better situation. The house on fire, that's too late.
Right. Yeah. It wasn't like we had to come up with this vision out of nowhere. It wasn't like, oh, like we've never thought about where we're going to be in 5 years. Like, I think Paul and myself, like Paul in particular, my boss, like we really had a set of where we wanted to be. Like we had that vision, technically. And then it was like suddenly the scramble to be like, okay, let's make it real. Like, let's ground it in the business outcome today. But it wasn't like coming up with the strategy, as you say, Jerry, like from scratch. Like, not that you should always be preparing for an M&A event, but I think there is like being able to, fall back on like, a future vision that is already kind of like an orienting goal for the team. And then saying we're going to dramatically shorten our delivery time versus we're going to pitch you on a future we've never told you about before, that we promise we can deliver you in 2 years, that we just came up with yesterday. Like, that's harder. I think that'd be a harder sell. But a lot of things we had talked about, like in terms of what we think we can deliver to switch the business, are concepts that the executive team had already heard. So it's like, oh, this is an acceleration. This is not like magic.
This is also part of the angle for how a new leader at a certain level that you got to find opportunity to make an impact yourself. You're not told to do something. You're too senior to do that. And this is a good example that now, even though things are good, but you can make massive impact by being proactive, by you know exercise strategic thinking, and then come up with ideas that will dramatically have like accelerate the technology transformation. With it probably nobody anticipated.
Well, I mean, just even like selfishly, I mean, it's like it actually allows the tech team to be thinking about the next thing, not thinking about the past. Right. So like from the moment that, we basically had the plan in place, we were always thinking to the future, and just having your brain space to be able to think about like, well, what's the next big thing? Like that fits into like what I'm working on now. It's like I'm working on something very different than I was at the time of the transaction that I didn't even anticipate then. But because I wasn't forced to be running all this like stuff over here, it gave me the brain space to be able to even see that future. And I think it's meaningful for the business, and it's meaningful to be able to have your tech leadership being able to think about the future of the business. Not just, as you say, Jerry, like kind of like doing marching orders or like taking commands or something about how to just make a thing happen.